Bon après-midi tout le monde. My name is Nathalie Laviadez-Jaudoin. I'm a Director General here at the Canada School, responsible for learning on respectful and inclusive workplaces. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that as I sit here in Ottawa this afternoon, I am on the traditional unceded territory of the Anishinaabe Nation. For all of you joining us today, wherever you might be, I invite you to take a moment to recognize and acknowledge the Indigenous territory you are on. On behalf of the school, I'd like to welcome you all to today's event entitled Disaggregated Data, a tool for diversity, inclusion, and equity. Today, I'm joined by a group of speakers with extensive knowledge and expertise in this area for a discussion that promises to be rich and informative. Before we start, however, a few housekeeping events to consider. L'interprétation simultanée.
Simultaneous interpretation is available in French if you want to follow this event in French only. So look at the email you received and you select the link French or the teleconference link in French.
We do encourage you to disconnect from your VPN if possible and to then reconnect to the event. Throughout the event, you may submit your questions by clicking on the icon that looks like a raised hand. There is someone monitoring the inbox who will submit the questions to the panelists. Lastly, these conversations can be emotional for some people, so we do encourage you to take care of yourself and your mental health, take a break if you need to, or reach out to resources such as the Employee Assistance Program. I'm now going to give the virtual floor over to our very first speaker, Mr. Anil Arora, the Chief Statistician of Canada, to provide some opening remarks. Mr. Arora, over to you.
Thank you very much, Natalie, and thanks to everybody who is virtually joining us today. It's a real pleasure, and thank you. Thank you for showing your support to this amazing event. Really, I just want to say take a few minutes and set the stage for this important discussion today. I'd say there's an urgent need for conversations like this one that we're having today. Recent events here and to the south of the border have exposed significant racial injustices, economic inequality, and the historical discriminatory treatment of Indigenous peoples. The COVID-19 pandemic has further exacerbated discriminatory barriers. The impact of the pandemic has not been felt equally. Diverse and vulnerable groups have been disproportionately affected. But the inequalities and the inequities exposed by the pandemic are not new. They pre-existed COVID and are now glaringly apparent. The pandemic has also exposed significant gaps in data and knowledge about the makeup of diverse communities in Canada and the impacts that they are now experiencing. Which brings me to the first key point that I want to stress with you this afternoon. Let's ask ourselves, why do these data gaps exist, and what role have we, as a public service, played in their continued existence? Est-ce que nous avons décidé consciemment?
Have we decided, consciously or not to gather such data or take into account such discrepancies? So we must now think of what's missing in our data and think how we should treat that. So are these data to be included or not? And how do we integrate the sources? Stats Canada has been telling the story of diversity in this country, thanks, among other things, to the population census. And we've been following the socioeconomic tendencies of marginalized populations in this country. But there are still many discrepancies in disaggregated data for basic data. Now, to answer to such needs, Stats Canada has done a lot, and we have adopted some new methods, and we decided to play an important role to fulfill the needs that we have in terms of data and data regarding diversity will be now included in all of our work. In our surveys, we have the questions that will produce disaggregated data, questions such on, for instance, on ethno-cultural groups. And the pandemic and recent social events have allowed us to add some new questions on the active population in our survey of last July, and this way we can measure the working conditions on the market. These data were not required before, now they are, and this way we can fulfill we can now fill the gaps that we used to have. Now, we're going to need the support of all orders of government and all the members of the civil society.
The impact of these gaps in disaggregated data, they have not been without consequence. Gaps in disaggregated data have resulted in underreported characteristics of COVID-19 positive cases, the lack of information on financial impacts of the pandemic on vulnerable communities, and have hampered the ability to identify which communities have more challenges with the physical distancing measures, who's wearing masks or not, and other unintended consequences of COVID-19. We do not yet have a full understanding of the reasons why Canadians with different social backgrounds and from marginalized communities are being unequally impacted by COVID-19. Consider what is happening in Brampton in the Peel region of Toronto, for example, where the COVID-19 test positivity rate is reported to be higher than for the overall city in the region. The chief public health officer there has been quoted as saying that Brampton's picture is largely driven by disparity, while others point to possible language barriers in public health messaging and possible greater exposure to the virus due to a higher concentration of workers in essential services and jobs where working from home is just not possible. COVID-19 is clearly having an unequal impact, not only through its direct health effects, but also indirectly across multiple spheres. We have seen higher COVID-19 mortality rates in neighborhoods with a higher proportion of population groups designated as visible minorities. For many reasons, these groups are at increased risk of COVID-19 infection and mortality. Many have higher poverty rates, are overrepresented in socioeconomically disadvantaged neighborhoods, are more likely to live in overcrowded housing, and to work in occupations at greater risk of being infected by the virus. COVID-19 is taking a toll on Canadians' mental health. Groups designated as visible minorities have reported experiencing poorer mental health during the pandemic, and the pandemic has also had a higher impact on their ability to meet their financial obligations. Compared with a year earlier, the unemployment rate increased to a greater extent in October 2020 among Chinese, Black, South Asian, and Filipino Canadians than among those who were not Indigenous and not a visible minority. The pandemic has also had significant impacts on Indigenous peoples. Employment among Indigenous people has been slower to recover than for non-Indigenous Canadians. Indigenous participants to a crowdsourcing on perception of safety reported being twice as likely to feel that people are being harassed or attacked because of their ethnicity or skin color, and were more likely to report being concerned with the impact of COVID-19 on violence in their home. These societal inequities for Indigenous peoples are deeply embedded and reflect systemic barriers that are largely the result of Canada's history of colonialization and the compounding impact on Indigenous people. We see them reflected in the overrepresentation of Indigenous people in the criminal justice system. Yet, until recently, criminal justice statistics have been descriptive in nature, not delving into the role of systemic barriers in overrepresentation. Recently, we've worked with the province of Saskatchewan, for example, to better understand how addressing these barriers, such as reducing the education gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, may impact justice overrepresentation. Simply put, data enables leaders to see sooner and act faster. In a rapidly evolving environment like a pandemic, leaders need data-driven insights as decision support to quickly spot challenges and opportunities. They not only need to act with speed, they also need to act wisely based on the best available trusted evidence. Which brings me to my third point this afternoon. Data are not necessarily neutral. Like any other element, they have characteristics and reflect our values and also our biases as a society. Consider for a moment what we choose to include in measures of disability. The Canadian Survey on Disability is based on a social model of disabilities, meaning that disability is a result of the interaction between a person's functional limitations and barriers in the environment. This necessarily includes visible and not so visible disabilities, like learning and developmental and mental health related disabilities. Also consider visible minority as a concept. What does it mean in today's society, and what might it hide when used as an overall category for describing very diverse experiences for diverse groups of Canadians? Are all Blacks experiencing the same issues in Canada? What this means is that it is impossible to have trusted information on diversity and inclusion in Canada without strong statistical standards that clearly define the concepts that are being measured. And we at Statistics Canada play a leading role in ensuring that strong standards are developed and adopted as part of the national statistical system so that we can take care of biases that may be inherent. And finally, I'd like to leave you with a call to action that's aligned with the federal government's data strategy. The strategy speaks to the power of data in enabling the government to make better decisions, design better programs, and deliver more effective services. And it points to the need for stronger data governance, improved data literacy and skills, enabling infrastructure and legislation, and valuing data as an asset. Key to this is a public service with the expertise to leverage data for public good. And I applaud the school for the role they are playing in capacity building, convening sessions such as the one today, and in promoting a respectful and inclusive workplace for all of us in the public service. We look forward to further leveraging the collaboration with our Center for Gender Diversity and Inclusion, and you'll hear more from the director, Tina Chu, in just a few moments. So I thank you all. I encourage you to have open and impactful discussions today and continue to live our public service values as leaders in our own rights. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Aurora, for taking the time to set the stage for a very important conversation today. I know you're a very busy person, but feel free to stick around with us for as long as you're able. And thank you again for taking the time to set the stage for us today. So with that, it gives me a great pleasure to introduce to you our guest panelists for today. First off, Dr. Deborah Thompson, who's an associate professor at the Department of Political Science at McGill University. Dr. Thompson is a leading scholar on the comparative politics of race. Her teaching and research interests focus on the relationships between race, the state, and inequality in democratic societies. Her book, The Schematic State, Race, Transnationalism, and the Politics of the Census, is a study of the political development of racial classifications on the national censuses of the United States, Canada, and Great Britain. Thank you, Dr. Thompson, for joining us today. Our second panelist is Tina Chu, Acting Director of Diversity and Social Statistics at Statistics Canada. Ms. Chu will speak to Statistics Canada's Gender Diversity and Inclusion Statistics Hub. The hub serves as a focal point for data, which aims to address gaps in the availability of information by gender, sex, and other intersecting identity factors, such as disability status, Indigenous identity, and other ethno-cultural characteristics. The hub enables users to easily access and analyze a wealth of statistical information relevant to the evaluation of programs, policies, and initiatives from a gender diversity and inclusion perspective. Tina, thank you for joining us today. Last, but certainly not least, I'd like to introduce to you Richard Sharp. Mr. Sharp is the co-founder of the Federal Black Employee Caucus, or FBEC, and the Director of Equity, Anti-Racism, Diversity, and Inclusion at the Department of Justice. As co-founder of FBEC, Richard has developed and revitalized employee-driven networks of workers of color within the federal government and built partnerships with communities of color in the larger society. Welcome, Richard. Thank you for joining us today as well. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to our panelists to provide their opening remarks, starting with Dr. Thompson, followed by Tina, and finally Richard. Deborah, over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you all for having me here. I assume you can hear me okay? Thumbs up? Yes, okay, great. So I assume I'm here in part because I wrote a book on the census, which compares the political development of racial classifications and categories on the Canadian, British, and American censuses. And I thought quite a bit about the modes of racial classification that we use in democratic societies. And so what I want to do today is just kind of give you, I just have 4 things that I want to talk about. The first is the necessity of racial data. The second is our discomfort around collecting racial data. The third is the reality or the politics of collecting racial data. And the fourth is some dangers or challenges that I see. So first, in terms of the necessity of collecting racial data, Canada is way behind. We're just way behind comparatively in terms of how much racial data we have on a variety of socioeconomic indicators. In terms of just research, and in my discipline, political science, there's so much we don't know about the racialized nature of politics because we don't have data and we don't necessarily have people doing the work in political science to figure out the dynamics of racism and the extent of racial inequality that exists in our country. In my discipline, we frequently see immigration used as a proxy for race. So rather than talking about racialized minorities or even visible minorities, which is a category I don't like, and I will talk about why in a second, we hear a lot of talk about immigrants or second-generation immigrants or third-generation immigrants. And first of all, you cannot use immigration as a proxy for race. Those are 2 completely different social and political phenomena. Second, conflating race with immigration works to erase the very long histories of a number of racialized communities in this country. And it crafts a particular narrative of Canada that adheres to the mythology of the 2 founding nations to the exclusion of all others, right? It works to erase other narratives of other people who have been present in the country since before its founding. And I think it's highly dangerous. So we need more racial data. This is very clear. This is not just in the federal public service. This is in every sector. You know, here I'm sitting here in my McGill office. I'm like the only one in the building right now. And McGill has just begun to collect racial data on our incoming student cohort this year. So we don't know how many students are dropping out. We don't know if we're failing to retain certain kinds of students. We don't know any of the information that, frankly, as somebody who worked in the U.S. for 10 years, we had at our fingertips there. So that's the necessity piece. Second, let me talk about our discomfort. I know that Canadians are generally uncomfortable talking about race. This is just a fact of being Canadian. I think that there's a few reasons why we have this national discomfort around race. One, I think, is that our national identity, at least in Anglophone Canada, has frequently been formed in relation to the U.S. And we, as Canadians, frequently view America as the place where racism exists. And because being Canadian is being not American, racism can't possibly exist in Canada because we are not America. And that racial calculus has worked for a really long time to prevent us from taking seriously the realities of racial inequality and racial discrimination in this country. I also think that the dominant cleavage for most of Canadian history has been the English-French conflict, which again has interesting racial layers to it, which we can talk about in the Q&A if you're interested, but has more often than not worked to hide other forms of inequality that also exist in the country. And third, Canadian multiculturalism, as much as we celebrate diversity, multiculturalism is just that. It's a celebration. And so we celebrate a kind of race-neutral, colorblind multiculturalism that frequently fails to, again, take account of the very real racial inequality. More importantly, I think we have a discomfort in counting by race because counting by race in some ways runs contrary to the liberal democratic norms of our society. We are told that the self-evident truth of the liberal ideal is that we are all created equal and should be treated as such. And so in this logic, race shouldn't matter. And yet our societies are plagued by massive racial inequalities along nearly every socioeconomic indicator. And so on the one hand, counting by race is really the only way we have of getting at these inequalities. On the other hand, counting by race runs contrary to our dominant norms of egalitarianism and universalism. So third, let me talk about the politics and realities of counting by race. Labels are useful as shorthands, but they also hide quite a bit. So the visible minority category, the visible minority label ends up hiding an awful lot. And how groups came to be included in that category of visible minority is not as purposeful as you think. It's actually kind of an accident of history, which I am looking forward to exploring more when I get to go to the archives again when this pandemic ends. And ultimately, when we make decisions about which people, which populations belong in which category, those are decisions that engage understandings of inclusion and exclusion, right? Categories are inclusive and exclusive by nature. That's the nature of classifications. That's what makes them work. And this means that we have to make judgment calls on who belongs and who doesn't. And maybe some of that strikes us as being kind of icky, and that's because it is. People have really complicated identities, and race as a concept really isn't what you think it is. So most commonly, we associate race with morphological and physiological ideas or concepts like skin color, like hair texture, like eye shape and size. That's what we normally associate with race. But of course, we know that race is a social construct. And even the reference to those physiological characteristics is part of the social construct of race itself. So what this means is that race isn't just about appearance. Race has never in its history been about a person's appearance. Race has also been this conglomerate of appearance and ancestry and awareness of one's ancestry and allegiances and community acceptance and performativity. And the racial practices that exist in a given society actually work to produce our understandings of race. Right? So race itself isn't a politically neutral concept. It's produced by and through exercises of power. Power is a fundamental element of what we understand of as race. So racial categories end up being this convenient shorthand for identities that are transgressive, that are unruly, that are hard to pin down. And it's that shorthand that the categories we use, which take on a life of their own, but that can never really capture the wholeness of our identities, right? Because they're shortcuts. They're meant to make something legible, something that is by its nature transgressive. It's meant to make it legible. Racial classification is a type of decision-making that is most conveniently done in shadows, in part because it is contested and is highly political. I think that now in the 21st century, the way that we think is best to count and classify by race is to enable people to self-identify as they see themselves. But there are still some challenges with that. So let me now move on to the last part of my presentation, which is on some dangers or challenges. So counting accurately is, of course, an incredible challenge, and I assume Tina will talk more about that. But there's also challenges if we only rely on self-identification. There are challenges in counting by race using just that mechanism. So there's been a lot of work recently, and here I'm thinking about the work of Darrow LaHoo and Kim Tallbear on what they call race shifters, which they define as white people who take on Indigenous identities in order to gain access disingenuously to resources that have been designated for our Indigenous communities. There's a sociologist who's now at Penn. Her name is Wendy Roth, and she's done a lot of work on this idea of race shifting, and finds that after white people take those Ancestry.com tests, they frequently describe their identities differently unless those Ancestry.com tests reveal a Black ancestry, in which case they don't, right? So there's still, I think this is what the chief statistician was talking about, like these are not politically neutral. There's still these threads of power that run through, and these threads of like anti-Black racism, right? That run through how people choose to self-identify. There's also been a number of high-profile incidents lately in my industry of higher education where white people who have been claiming Latinx identity or Black identity are revealed to have been lying about that. And it's highly problematic because they are taking spaces, they're making spaces for themselves and making claims about their identity, which they have used to enrich themselves on the back of other people's labor. Now, I also want to point out that having more data will not magically solve all of our problems. You know, at the top of the sheet, I had that famous quote from Albert Einstein, not everything that can be counted counts, and not everything that counts can be counted. And that's very true. Having more racial data is not going to solve all of our problems. In the United States, for example, there's a lot of racial data. And there's still a lot of racism, you know, like we have a lot of data on why the dropout rate for African-American students is double or triple that of white students in their institutions of higher education. And yet, not much has been done about that problem. So having more racial data in and of itself won't magically make racism go away. Also, we know that not having data is frequently used as an excuse to do nothing, which sometimes I think political elites, that is the preferred course of action. Like, let's not pretend that racial inequality doesn't benefit some people. It absolutely does. White privilege is privilege for a reason, and eradicating white privilege means some people will have to give up something. We also know that racial data, we have a lot of information on the structural barriers that exist, and having more racial data isn't necessarily going to alleviate those barriers, right? Like, we know that, for example, Black and Indigenous civil servants having language qualifications poses a huge structural barrier for many people who don't have access to language training either in the civil service or in their education before getting to the civil service. We know, for example, that having more data isn't going to solve hostile climates. It's not going to prevent old boys networks from forming. It isn't going to change the racialized and gendered and biased language that we use as when we write reference letters for employees. Data isn't magic. But what it will do is give us some social scientific evidence that we can then use to make good public policy. The last thing I want to say is that in collecting racial data, for people inside the federal civil service, and I used to work for the civil service, and I understand this, I know that you feel as public servants that you are doing good and that you exist to serve the public, and that is a noble cause, and I salute all of you. But I want you to know that from the perspective of many minority groups in Canada, the state is not your friend, right? The state is the definition of a state is an entity that maintains a monopoly over the legitimate use of violence in a given territory, and many people who live in race class subjugated communities, their experience interacting with the state and with the government is violent, it's coercive, it's punitive, and the state is not to be trusted. And so when it comes to collecting racial data, there is a lot of trust that you as civil servants need to earn from the populace, because frankly, racial data has been used in the past in this country to harm racialized populations. And so good intentions are not going to, again, solve all of our problems. Let me end there.
Thank you very much, Deborah. And I am sure, there's already questions starting to come in, and I can anticipate a lot more will be coming in. So looking forward to getting into the conversation. So thank you very much for that. Tina Chu, over to you to tell us a little bit more about the Hub. Go ahead.
Okay, good. And I assume everybody hear me okay. So thank you for the opportunities to speak at this event and be in the same panel with my fellow distinguished panelists for a very important issue facing Canada today and tomorrow. As public servants, all the work that we do affects a diverse group of people. And because of the impacts of our work, we have to consider that groups of people are not homogeneous, and they have multiple and diverse intersecting identity factors that impact on how they understand and experience government initiatives, programs, and policy. Therefore, it is so important that we use GBA Plus to better address the needs of the diverse groups of women, men, and non-binary individuals in Canada. I was asked to speak about the Center for Gender Diversity and Inclusion Statistics at Statistics Canada. I will refer to it as the Center, and I will speak about the objectives of the Center, and then I will share some of the challenges in developing disaggregated data, and finally, some of the opportunities for us to consider going forward. So let's talk about the objectives of the Center. The Center was established in 2018. Generally speaking, the Center identifies and addresses gaps in the availability of disaggregated data on sex, gender, and other intersecting identity characteristics to enrich our understanding of social, economic, and environmental issues. Specifically, the Center has 3 goals or objectives. The first one being that we would report to Canadians about the state and progress of gender diversity and inclusion in Canada. For example, by disseminating relevant data through the Gender Diversity and Inclusion Statistics Hub and a new analytic product in a variety of formats. The Hub, you will hear me refer to it several times. The Hub can be accessed through the StatScan website. But the Hub is only the public face of the Center. We do a lot more. And we work to generate new information to increase knowledge on diversity and inclusion. We develop new concepts and measures to address intersecting characteristics. We engage in discussion with folks in policy and program development to identify and address data gaps. As well, we adopt leading-edge methods and techniques to integrate data sources. I think we can agree that if we all use the same standards to measure what we want to measure, we have better chance to produce information that is reliable, valid, and comparable. So from the Hub, you can find definitions of concepts on population characteristics, such as sex, gender, immigrant status, indigenous identity, and other ethnocultural measures. With respect to analytic work to increase our understanding on diversity and inclusion, the Center recognizes the importance of intersectionality of population characteristics. For example, while gender can explain the socioeconomic outcomes, the age, which reflects the life cycle of individuals, the ethnocultural background, whether the individual is a female who is an immigrant or member designated as visible minorities, or indigenous status, etc., are also factors that can contribute to the lived experience. So we make sure that when we examine the data, if the data allowed us to drill down into different levels of details. The third objective of the Center is to build statistical capacity to increase knowledge of gender, diversity, inclusion, and gender-based analysis. We serve as StatScan's knowledge center on gender, diversity, and inclusion. We assist other government departments to access disaggregated data. We deliver GBA Plus workshop to other government departments and contributes to the Canada School of Public Service with the aim to build and enhance statistical knowledge across the federal public service. During our training workshop, we can have a walkthrough of the hub on how to find various information. Under Canada's anti-racism strategy, there is an increased demand for the collection and dissemination of disaggregated data that can be broken down by meaningful categories of race and/or ethnocultural origins. Furthermore, what do we mean by inclusion? How do we define such concept, and what might be the statistical indicators for the concept? Going forward, results from our anti-racism projects will be communicated using the hub. Let me now turn to some of the challenges and opportunities in developing disaggregated data. I would like to highlight the challenges and opportunities around adopting the diversity, inclusion, and equity lens in every aspect of the statistical process. What I mean by that is how to ensure we apply the perspective when we determine the content of our data development, when we collect our data, process, analyze, as well as disseminate the information. With respect to content determination, we need to make sure that the content and the information needs are relevant to the communities that we are talking about. In other words, this is not an armchair exercise, but require collaborations with all levels of government, as well as the communities. I would also like to say that collaborations go beyond content determination, but collaborations to promote data collection, like the census questionnaire available in different languages, so to help people with different mother tongue to respond to the census. Survey questions were tested to make sure they are understood by the target population for that given survey. I talk about the importance of systematically measure and produce indicators on vulnerable populations earlier. Traditionally, we think of standard measures and survey data, but as we are increasing our use of administrative data for statistical purpose, comparability across different collection vehicles becomes a challenge. StatsCan recently established an internal working group specifically to address this challenge. For those of us who work with quantitative data analysis, we are quite aware that in order to have more diversity lens and intersectional analysis, we need larger sample sizes for the disaggregation in order to produce robust statistics. Large sample data, however, requires resources and good response rate. While StatsCan actively engage the public or communities to produce survey participation, survey data alone is not the answer. One of StatsCan's modernization efforts is to adopt alternate tools, such as working with partners and communities to access existing alternative data sources like administrative data, crowdsourcing, or data linkage to build content. Using administrative data and data linkage generally reduce the demand on resources, but also reduce response burden. As StatsCan is exploring options for alternate data sources, I would like to echo the argument from the Chief Statisticians of Canada that a national data strategy with strong governance is a way forward. In fact, Canada is heading to increasing diversity. That's no doubt about that. According to the 2016 census, close to 22% of the population made up of people who came here as immigrants. And in the Toronto census metropolitan area, immigrants and second-generation individuals represent 75% of the populations in 2016. The proportion could rise to 77 to 81% in 36. Nationally, in 2016, 39.6% of the population was first and second generations in Canada, and this proportion could rise to 44 to 50% in 2036. By now, we have learned that the impact of COVID-19 were felt unevenly across the population. We also learned that certain vulnerable communities become more vulnerable under the pandemic. The unequal impact of the pandemic are likely to be felt for years to come, beyond the availability of a vaccine. And as such, disaggregated data on Canada's diverse population is needed more than ever. I apologize, my phone is ringing. I should have turned it off. But anyway, I'm just about done my discussions. The thought of all of us as public servants, how we can use data to make evidence-based decisions to address the inequality, even before the pandemic, so that we can achieve a more inclusive and equitable society. And thank you for letting me speak on that.
Thank you, Tina. And I thought it was intentional as part of your closing credits to have this accompanying music. It was perfectly timed. So there you go. Thank you for that. Richard, over to you. Yep. Richard, over to you. Oh, you're still on mute, Richard, sorry.
Okay, thank you. I think you guys can hear me now. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak today. Very happy to be following both Deborah and Tina and the Chief Statistician, as they pretty much said what I would have said in my opening remarks, although I would provide maybe some context around that with respects to sort of how we move forward in using disaggregated employment equity, disaggregated race-based data to make decisions around how we address some of the inequities within our society. First thing I would like to say that I would add something to the list of what the Chief Statistician said with respects to how we can react when we use data. We can react smarter with data in a way that's more informed than what we usually do, which tends to be, as governments and as institutions, very reactive. I wanted to situate the data discussion actually sort of in two sort of foundational pieces. One being data itself. Data is foundational to being able to do this work right. But also, I would switch the titles around and I would put equity before diversity and inclusion. And that's because diversity and inclusion by itself does not bring about change. It's very aspirational. It reminds me a lot of, Rodney King during the 1990s riots in Los Angeles over the acquittal of the 4 officers that beat him senseless. And the need and his cry out for, like, can't we all just get along? Well, Rodney, no, we can't just all get along, even with a really strongly worded constitution that is supposed to enshrine your human rights. More than 20 years later, your streets continue to burn with the same kind of racial inequity issues that were sort of foundational to the country. So diversity and inclusion by itself, as aspirational as it is, we always want to get there. You can't get there without some form of equity or some kind of measurement. And equity does, even though it's not perfect in how we practice it within public service. Equity affords for the ability to measure, the ability to use data, to track, and to actually marry up the qualitative or the storytelling of other human beings that we happen to work with or within our society that tell us that they're having issues, that this country is not as equal as the Charter of Rights professes it to be, and use that data in a quantitative way in terms of representation and so on to help marry that story to give a complete picture of what the problem is, what the issue is in terms of what we want to achieve. So it's foundational, I think, to all of this work. And when I was with the Federal Black Employee Caucus, it was one of our main priorities. The principal priority was the collection of disaggregated data. Government did not do that very well and still has its challenges. The whole premise around that was to get a handle on what the situation is, what our realities are, based on the numbers that exist that we can collect. I would like to say that the whole idea around using Statistics Canada as data and the work from Stats Canada is sort of really foundational, again, in being able to do more than the performative. I think we do a lot of work in government around, culture days and, let's try each other's food. And that's by itself supposed to address the inequities that we face in employment in terms of discrimination or racism, the things that the Public Service Employee Survey is articulating that employees are experiencing. And so without this data, and when we look at like Stats Canada, for example, and the great work that it does external to the public service, our question has always been, why doesn't that marry more with what we do internally to government? Why is it that we are always trying to create new processes to counting people when we actually can marry some of the great work in terms of statistical excellence that comes out of Stats Canada? I think we're in a position now where we have to make some decisions around how we use data, how we look at data, given the changes in our population. We are using labor market availability data or workforce availability data that is always baselines that are always old. Like we look back to 2016 now for what the representation rates are within the country, when in reality, some of our populations are growing exponentially in this country. So that 4-year span does not actually give us an accurate picture of even where we are right now, let alone where we need to be. I believe that, and we believe as employees, and I guess I'm not an employee anymore, but folks have been calling for departments, central agencies, those who are responsible for taking care of this data, to work with Stats Canada much more closely on forecasting so that we can look at what the future of the public service looks like based on the statistical demographic models that we have today. And then we won't always be sort of telling these sort of fairy tale stories about how we're representative, when in fact we're not even close. And so that's some of the work that I'll be doing with my new department in terms of the work that I'm doing with the Anti-Discrimination, Anti-Racism Secretariat, is to work with Stats Canada and our HR teams to develop models that are actually much more realistic and give us goals in which we can achieve. And those goals are not what some people who like to sort of squash this work talk about, quotas and inequalities and reverse racism. I think that the introduction, the opening comments that Deborah provided really outlines the sort of foundation as to why we are doing this work. Why FBEC was created is because we couldn't get this stuff done through the existing structures. So Black employee networks are popping up all over the place in departments to put particular focus on an area that just is not covered by existing structures, models. So I think there's really a call for that, and I think that the risk to the public service has always been that if you don't get a handle on it, it becomes sort of expensive and not well received in the courts, certainly the court of public opinion. I think that it's important for us not to be afraid of data. I think that Deborah alluded to this. We have a profound fear in this country of race-based data and what the true numbers will say about who we are as a nation, who we are as a public service. It is quite apparent that the public service is changing. The demographics of this workforce is changing. It's browning. It's becoming more diverse, even without the data. So all the data does is just give more. It helps us to explain what's actually already happening and being able to plan for it. If we're constantly looking back and using old data, outdated data, data that does not reflect the fact, for example, that the black population in this country doubled between 2006 and 2016, that the black population in the National Capital Region grew by 73% within a very short period of time and will continue to grow. What does that mean for the public service in terms of who's actually going to be knocking on the door to apply for jobs? I would like to say that the whole using diverse and inclusive approaches to collecting data is actually really critical. And I think, again, Deborah had mentioned this in terms of the lack of trust on the part of the population. That lack of trust exists within the public service. We have regimes like self-ID, which is a failed construct. It doesn't work. People don't want to self-ID. There's a stigma around self-ID. And as much as it's the only way that we can quantify our existence, we do realize that there needs to be another way. And I think a way that sort of marries census and work that we do in the public service is a way forward for us to address this. It is amazing to me that in the United States, that has so many challenges with its race-based conflicts and realities, collects such better data than we do as this nice and polite public service. Engaging with the diverse groups within the public service is critically important to being able to be successful. If you keep doing what you've always been doing for the last 20 years, you're going to get the same results. And again, the press that we have, at least from the employee side and now, from me and a number of black executives, is to push for different ways of engaging us on the data file, and for us to also be part of the development and design of initiatives and strategies that address these issues in a real sort of full-throated way. This concept of co-creation is an elusive dream if you actually are not including the people who are most affected by racism, anti-black racism, anti-indigenous racism, anti-Asian racism in the planning and the strategies and development of your programming. You are going to get back to the same place that you have been over the last 20 years. And so instead of resisting and to some extent excluding employee groups like FBEC, I think it's important to embrace the change that we represent. Because more likely or not, we're not going anywhere. I'm vested. I've been here for 24 years, and so I'm going to retire here. And what I'd like to leave as part of my legacy in this public service is that we are actually addressing these issues, and that people are not going through this suffering and lack of people are not being respected and valued in the way that they should. We're representing we're representing the Canadian population. And when we get this right internally in terms of data collection, in terms of that informing strategies, people-centered strategies, employee-centered strategies, then we won't fall into the traps and the mistakes that we made even during this COVID-19 pandemic, when Black and racialized communities went to governments and said, we are going to be disproportionately impacted. This was back in February. There was no response, partly because part of people inside of government, the folks making decisions did not look like us, didn't have the affinity, and probably did not believe us. 6-7 months later, the data comes out, and the epicenters of the virus and how it's impacting our people is in Black and racialized communities. So you need people on the inside to be able to inform policy, to be able to put in place proactive measures to address these issues so that this doesn't become a major problem. That's just one example of how working together with the groups that exist within the public service around data to address the issues of what you're measuring, how you're measuring it, how you collect the data, how you reach the people that you want to collect data from, both inside and outside public service, that resides with us, those of us who are Black, racialized, Indigenous within the public service. Do it right, and you'll get good results. If you don't, then we end up having this conversation over and over again over the next 25 years. I'll end my comments there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And as the quote states, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. So I'd say stop the madness. Let's get on with it. So with that, I'm seeing the questions coming in, and so I'd like to get us to that question and answer period, have an opportunity to dialogue here with our panelists. Maybe I'll start. A lot has come up around discomfort in data, fear of data, the question of trust, and there's a question here, and maybe I'll address it for comment to you first, Deborah. So given that, how can we protect the integrity of disaggregated data to ensure it doesn't get misused into stereotyping groups? I know that that's a fear.
I mean, it's a very well-founded fear. So the short answer is you can't, right? Because numbers, as we just said, numbers are not politically neutral. But they will be used however they are going to be used, right? And actually, you can think of the ways in which we've approached race and racism in this country as, one particular set of narratives around, the dynamics, the context, the emergence, the continuance, the persistence, and that's still happening even without data, right? And so I understand that the fear is that, okay, if we have data that demonstrates that Black communities are being hit hardest by COVID, which I'm pretty sure we have that data, actually, that seems obvious to me, then what's to stop people from saying, well, it's because Black people have weaker immune systems, right? Rather than having people say, well, it's because Black people are overrepresented in the type of jobs that are essential, and therefore they have higher exposure to like the conditions of the virus. And the short answer is just like, this is the work of political science. This is the work of social science, where we take explanations that are competing and we try to find which ones are the most accurate among the world of all the competing explanations. And look, when you're dealing with racial data, some of those explanations are going to be racist. That's just the way it is. And so it's up to us as good social scientists, as people, as critical thinkers, as people who do not believe that there's anything inherently inferior about anyone, regardless of their skin color or hair texture or eye shape and size. It's up to us to combat those types of explanations, like where and when we see them, especially when those explanations seem like they're not racist, but then you dig a little bit deeper and it turns out that they absolutely are, right? So seeking, like, if your baseline is that all human beings have equal moral worth, then find the explanations that have that concept baked into it. That's my answer. We're not gonna solve the use of the manipulation of data for racist purposes. That's like as old as race. That's actually the origins of statistics, to be honest. If you want to get super technical about it, like how statistics came about as a discipline was heavily tied to efforts to maintain slavery in the Western world.
Thank you, Deborah. Richard or Tina, anything you'd like to add on this question?
Yes. Sorry, Tina, do you want to jump in?
Go ahead.
Okay, I'll be brief, which is really hard for me. I totally agree that it's very difficult, if not almost impossible, to safeguard the integrity of the data when it's out there. It's important for us, as wherever we can, and those who have the ability to be involved in the analysis and the narratives that come out of data. Some of us are doing that with school systems. There are folks who are trying to engage policing. We have to do that in the public service and internally to the public service as well. And I think some of us are doing a pretty good job. Shared data released data from Okro our representation, disaggregated information, some of our people found some errors in that we weren't actually looking at the whole picture, only looking at a segment of the federal public service. So that might skew the numbers. There are people that are using data, subsets of data, to say, for example, that there's not enough, or there are no black people within the federal public service that could potentially become deputy ministers one day. We have to go external. But that data does not delve down to like EX-1, EX-2, where many of our PhD folks are languishing and have not been given opportunities because of systemic barriers within the system. So that's how data sometimes can be used against people. So you really do need some employee groups, executive groups, networks to help balance off what the bureaucracy tends to want to do, which is really maintain a certain semblance of status quo. But the status quo doesn't work for people like me. I'm always going to be at the bottom. So it's very important for us to, again, inject ourselves wherever we can in the whole discussion around data. For those who don't know about data, learn about it, read about it, understand what people are saying about you or other racialized people within the system using data, and then ask good questions. And I think that's really a good way for people to start who don't know, and for those people who do know to keep doing what you're doing, because I think it's having a positive impact, at least having folks be on notice that we have to do better and push for excellence when it comes to data collection, analysis, and then reporting.
And perhaps I would add briefly, I think, and some of you have touched on, it's when we interpret the statistics, and I think involving the communities to get that nuanced understanding of what we observe is very important. And so that's why we are very active, kind of as one of our modernization, StatsCan modernization, is actually reaching out to communities and to understand what some of the data means. And we are doing a lot of that efforts, particularly with the indigenous communities, and to get that better handle of what that phenomenon means. I think that's important.
Thank you for that. And in fact, if it can lead me to another question around who is analyzing the data and how it's being interpreted, I would say is just as important. And so how, and maybe Tina, I'll start with you. I know you're doing a lot of work in terms of teaching and the workshops that you've mentioned. So how do we make efforts to ensure that our, data analysis is not influenced, or that we can mitigate the influence of our own biases on how we interpret that data? Any tools or ways that you can share in terms of mitigating the risk of that bias creeping in?
Okay, so yes, that's a very interesting question, because we all have our own kind of assumptions on certain things. And so I stay in school for a long time and doing a lot of quantitative data analysis. So I think I would argue that it starts from there, in the sense that when we look at the data, we have to learn that objectivities, to look at different angles, so that we don't just tunnel ourselves into one path and when we look at the data. And I think we are also we put forward the GBA plus in a sense that, because a lot of the thing I mentioned earlier, that when we look at maybe gender issues, we should not just look at gender, but also be able to kind of look at, is that a different, is it because of age, and because of perhaps the visible minority status of women or men. And so that's when disaggregated data comes in handy. It's the sense that we need to kind of drill down to that level of detail, because identity, or who we are, is not just based on one concept or one a factor like our gender, but also different elements of it. So we should develop and be mindful about that diversity within what we are looking at, and be able to look into that and kind of go deeper and deeper into that.
Thank you, Deborah. Richard, anything you want to add in terms of how to mitigate the implicit bias when interpreting or analyzing the data?
No, again, it just goes to, again, having people involved with lived experience in the whole exercise. If you only have white men and women around the table who have their own biases, then you're going to get outputs that reflect their view of the world. It's the same as if I was doing the analysis, it would probably be very different than what comes out at the other end, and oftentimes is. So, again, that openness to real inclusion, we've been coining the term Black inclusion, but racialized inclusion of different peoples. Otherwise, you get the same results. And again, we're not very good at, and although we are good at pushing paper, we're good at sort of creating projects and initiatives, but we're not very good at being really inclusive in our thought processes and our engagements. So this one's a big one because, again, data is foundational to all of the exercises, social experiments, social exercises that we do. And if we don't get it right, then we end up making these kinds of policy mistakes or omissions or exclusions that, in the case of COVID, this is what the community has been telling me, external to the government, is that we end up dying because of institutional indifference or lack of understanding of what the lived experience is of Black and racialized people, or quantifying the historic experience that we've had in this country in terms of how we engage with institutions and so on. So again, it's critically important to have the right people around the table, or you will fail, or you will come up with something that just kind of keeps the status quo, which I think the majority of Canadians are saying, and public servants are saying, we're not down with the status quo anymore. So it gives us an opportunity for a different way forward.
I mean, I just wanted to, I can't say anything new. I agree with Tina and Richard. And I just wanted to say that when we're talking about this, it's not just about data. I know that people are attending this webinar to talk about data, but this is with all policies, all procedures, like having people around the table that can tell you how these policies, procedures, norms, informalities affect them is really crucial. A really quick example at the university I taught at before I came back to Canada was the University of Oregon. It was great. I had a lot of friends there. But Oregon's a weird state, and there are actual Nazis in Oregon, right? The alt-right has a strong foothold in places like Portland. I had Nazis in my classroom, and I remember talking to the dean of students at one point, and I was like, what do I do when there's like a hostile Nazi in my classroom that is being combative? What are my options? And she said, call campus police. And I said, that's not a good option for me. Right? Our campus police at the University of Oregon were armed. They had been accused of anti-Black racism frequently. And our research, speaking of research and data, our data demonstrate that when campus police see an altercation between a white person and a Black person, Black people frequently end up dead. So what are my other options besides calling campus police? And she had no answers for me because she had literally never considered that calling campus police wouldn't be an option for someone who looked like me, right? And so this is why having these alternate opinions is really important, because it turns out that what the policies that you view as normally or universally applicable aren't for many of us.
Thank you. That example really brings it home, certainly. Thank you for that. Let me move on to a question. Self-identification comes up time and time again. So I'll read out the following question. If self-ID, self-identification isn't working, should we be, in quotes, tinkering with it to use it for a more disaggregated approach, or are there better options internationally we can model ourselves on? Anyone would like to start off with that one?
So I can start very briefly. Yes. And Tina, I hope that you will jump in, because so there is an option that I talked with my students about frequently. And so Brazil has a very robust system of affirmative action, and specifically affirmative action in higher education. And in order to ensure that the people who are accessing those policies are Black or Indigenous, they have instituted a panel. This is my understanding of it. I haven't looked at it in a while, so this could be no longer accurate. Whereby, like, applicants are judged based on how, you know, on their phenotypes, essentially, their morphological, physiological characteristics. Now, understandings of race are very different in Brazil. I should mention it's not inherited in the same way. So you could have sisters who identify differently racially or identified differently racially. But when I talk to my students about the possibility that we'd have some kind of panel that will determine whether or not a Black person is actually Black, they are always like, that sounds terrible. And so this is a liberal paradox, right? Where, like, there's going to be some discomfort. There are going to be some challenges, right? In putting the primacy on self-identification, we're going to have people who lie about their identities in order to access, like, whatever perceived benefit they see as being associated with those identities. And that is, like, that's the price of self-identification. But that's, like, a basic principle of racial classification that we have had in place in international statistics since at least the 1970s. And Tina, correct me if I'm wrong on any of that.
Tina, go ahead, and then Richard for comment as well.
Okay, so self-identification actually is one of the major way that we collect data. Like, in the context of survey, we rely on our respondents to self-identify, like with respect to their ethnocultural origins. Some are more, how will I say that, objective type measures than the other. Like, identity is obviously a more objective measure, but like a place of birth or mother tongues, like those are a little bit more objective measures. So I think it boils down to, and we respect, like, people, how they respond to our questions. I think it boils down to the issues of trust, in the sense that, like, my question is, why wouldn't people who perhaps members of, like, visible minority do not self-identify? We mentioned earlier, Deborah, you mentioned earlier about the challenge of a stigma. And so that, I guess, fundamentally, you have to trust the collection vehicle, that this data will be used in an objective way. It's not to be used in a harmful way, and we respect the perspective from people directly from the communities. So that's perhaps one area that we would, like, or stats can try to address, perhaps these issues of self-identification. I think the other is, I will link back to our topic today, which is disaggregated data, because yes, perhaps someone might have issues identifying, but then you look at other characteristics which kind of give us a little bit more of a construct validity of perhaps identity. So in a sense that, like, if we if we are able to drill down to more disaggregated data, that someone who could be, like, foreign born, coming from a specific country with a certain type of mother tongue or religion, it gives you a little bit more of confidence to say that, okay, I think it's quite likely that this person could be, if we can use the word classify for better terminology, that this person could be like with this type of characteristics or could identify as so-and-so.
Richard?
The self-ID thing always makes me laugh, and I apologize. I'm going to share a story that I've probably shared on this platform before, but I got to do it again because it's very apropos. I've had conversations with people, particularly Black people within the public service, about self-ID. Those who say, I would never self-identify, and I'm speaking to a Black person, and they say, well, why wouldn't you self-identify? This is the way you can be quantified. And I said, well, I don't want anybody in my office to know that I'm Black. And I always say, you know, brother, you've lost your mind, man. You're Black. When you get pulled over by a cop, you're not being pulled over because you're driving below the speed limit, right? When you don't get that job, oftentimes, even though you're the most qualified, you're not getting that job because you self-identified or didn't self-identify. We don't have to self-identify to catch hell in this society. But we need to self-identify in order to avail ourselves of programs and initiatives to address inequities. So there's something inherently flawed in the system where, you know, that can happen and happens over and over again where our people don't feel comfortable, don't feel the trust to self-identify, but then we catch hell in so many other ways. There are people who are identifying us and denying us access to opportunities and so on. So, you know, it's, I also cite a couple of 20 years ago, actually, during the Embracing Change initiative, when we were doing this for visible minorities, and we started having programs for visible minorities. And just as Deborah said, I remember being part of a panel where they were looking, HR folks were looking at the submissions for a CAP or some executive development program for visible minorities. And the white guy, you know, submitted himself as a visible minority, and they had to, you know, have a special meeting with him and set him aside and said, well, you're not really a visible minority. And he says, well, I self-identified. We said, but you're not a visible minority. You have no lineage that goes back to any racialized group other than Europe. But he felt that, you know, he should be able to avail himself. And actually, if you look at the way the system is designed, he should be able to self-identify as a visible minority. Like the system is a bit messed up in that way. But who am I to go and tell a blonde, blue-eyed guy that he doesn't have indigenous or Black lineage and therefore should be? So I can have that conversation because I have a pretty strong sort of race consciousness. You know, race is a social construct. It's not really about facial features, although our facial features are used to differentiate us. Race is about our experience as being Black or Asian or indigenous, and so if you are not socialized, I knew a friend, not a friend, but I knew someone who had two twins, one that was white, and fraternal twins. One that was white, blonde, blue-eyed, one that was black like night. And the child, as the child grew up, the child socialized as white, and the other child as Black because they knew and identified as such, even though they had one Black parent. So it's problematic. It's problematic, the system that we have right now. It's open, it's rife to misuse or non-use in the case of folks who don't want to participate, and therefore it skews the numbers and doesn't give us an accurate picture. We need to do something, like I said, let's talk this. I think Stats Canada has an enormous amount of tools at their disposal that we can harmonize with the information that we have within the public service to get a handle on this. And to migrate over to a system that is not so much dependent on ticking a box, at least not in a way that makes people feel vulnerable, because people feel vulnerable when they self-identify, at least from Black and racialized groups.
Thank you, Richard. Tina, I see that you raised your hand, maybe very quickly, so we can try and get to one more question.
Sorry, I forgot to mention about, I think, Deborah, you mentioned about perhaps another way to use the panel to determine, perhaps certain trade might be easier to do so, but I want to put it on the table that there are invisible characteristics, like very a good example is disability, that like certain disabilities is invisible. So you do need that self-identification. And the other aspect is that we always mention that sometimes when people identify you as certain characteristic, that itself could be racist. So that's why we have to be very careful. Thank you.
Yes.
And Tina, just to acknowledge as well on the question chat, people are interested in getting some more information on the workshops given by the Hub. So what I'll commit to do is for us to send this information to those who are registered to today's event so that they can get it directly and know exactly where to access it. So with that, there's a specific question. Deborah, you mentioned you didn't like the term visible minority. Do you want to say a little bit more to help us understand that, please?
You bet. How much time do we have? So, visible minorities. Okay. One is that we know that the category visible minority came out of the Abella report. Mm-hmm. Where did Abella get it from? We are told that from Immigration and Citizenship Canada was using those categories at the time. But the truth is that we don't know, and if there's anyone out there listening from SSHRC, give me that grant that I applied for, and I will find out. This is actually part of one of my next research projects is like, where did this category come from? Let me find out. Because it's become such standard lexicon, and we don't know its origins. So problems with visible minority category. One is that it hides so much. We're talking about disaggregated data. The use of the visible minority category just lumps together not even all racialized minorities, just this like kind of random consortium of racialized minorities. And again, came into being at a time when Canada was very different, like in terms of diversity. The early 1980s, look, if you look at the 1981 census, Canada is 96% white, right? Like it's a white place. And the country doesn't start to get like really more diverse until the late 80s and 90s, and the visible minority was being used at that point. So it doesn't necessarily reflect the way that our demographics have changed over time. It hides an awful lot. It aggregates all the experiences of visible minority and equivocates them, right? It creates symmetries between experiences that may in fact be asymmetrical. It assumes that all visible minority groups are similarly placed in levels of stratification or their relationship to whiteness. Whereas we know, for example, the work of Eduardo Bonilla Silva in the U.S. talks about how the Latinx population there, in some circumstances, can access some white privileges, or there are white Latinos and Latin Latinas in the U.S. The visible minority category also makes it seem as though racialized minorities are allies or work in coalition. It's frequently used to present coherence, either in terms of political alliances or social conditions where there is none. It's also used to fearmonger, right? The idea of like the majority-minority city. Meanwhile, Black people may not have anything in common with West Indians, right? Like, so there's I think the visible minority category does an awful lot of harm. There's also something about its insistence on visibility that rubs me the wrong way, because I think in part because it reifies that idea of race as physiological, race as being based in appearance, when in fact race is fundamentally, again, about power. It's also, and this is the last thing I'll say, that was a good laundry list though. The last thing I'll say is that like visible minority, if you look at the definition from the Abella report, it's like anyone who's non-Caucasian in race or non-white in color. It's call a spade, man. Like if it walks and talks like race, just say the word race. Right? Like, it's just another way that Canadians avoid talking about race by using terminology that makes them more comfortable, and discomfort is not necessarily a bad thing.
Thank you. So I'm making a choice here. I'm going to sneak in one more question, but the challenge to my guest panelists is to take 30 to 45 seconds max to answer, given that 3 o'clock is upon us. So the question is around what you brought forward, Richard, in terms of equity first. And so the question is as follows. There's a movement to move beyond diversity and inclusion towards social justice and equity, which works to actively change the policies that create policies and practices that create inequality. What are some key things? And I'll ask each of you one thing. I know there's several, but one thing, key thing you think needs to happen to get us there. Richard, maybe starting with you.
Oh, that's so not fair. I have to think about it. I knew it. But I guess what comes to mind is that we do need, there's a lot of diversity, inclusion training, anti-bias training. I think that actually what we need is an anti-oppression perspective to this work. And so training as a starting point, because we always start with training to solve all of our problems. But anti-oppression, race theory, race consciousness work within our executives, our HR folks, our planners, our policy people. So that's something that I'm going to try to push through my department. It helps us establish a better foundation.
Thank you. Tina, one thing. Oh, you're on mute. You're still on mute.
Sorry. Okay. All right. So I think like when I mentioned earlier that we need to use the gender diversity and inclusion lens in the development, like in the statistical process. That's my daily life, because every day I compile, I determine content, I compile data, I collect data, I analyze them. So that's like, and we always apply that lens to what we do. Since we are all public servants here, our audience, so I would ask, kind of look at what you do on a daily basis and how you can integrate that. Be conscious, like what Richard said, like with that lens, and to apply to whatever things that we will do. I think that would be the very first step when we develop policies and programs. Thank you.
Deborah, final word to you.
Okay, I have two things to say really, really quickly. One is we need a much better understanding of what structural racism actually is, right? Structural racism, people think it's that what will happen when we don't have any more racists in our systems or structures, but it's not, right? Structural racism is even if there were no racists in the system, we would still have racist outcomes, right? Because the system is self-perpetuating. We need a much better understanding of structural racism and systemic racism. And the last thing I'll say, I guess, is two more things. One is I think I should run a course for you and people can learn about this stuff. And you should all take it. And two is read James Baldwin, because one of the things James Baldwin asked us to think about is why on earth we would want to be integrated into a burning house. And let's build something better.
All right. Thank you for that. So to all of you, so this concludes today's event. A few other questions we didn't get to, but we got to the majority. I'm glad. There's just so much we could be here for days, frankly. And in fact, I should mention there's going to be a bit of a part 2 to this event, where the focus is going to be looking at data and how we collect it internally to look at structural and systemic barriers within the public service. So that's on December 4th. So that's my plug for that. So the conversation does continue because there is so much to unpack here. So I would like to thank, first of all the participants that have joined us today. Thank you very much for engaging with us, for being part of this dialogue. And we hope that you found it rich and informative as we sort of lay the foundations. And to quote our chief statistician, I'm really marked by, data allows us to see sooner, to act sooner, but I'll add Richard's piece as well, and to be smarter. And so with that, on behalf of the school, I do want to thank our panelists, starting with Mr. Arora, who joined us earlier, but as well, Deborah Thompson, Tina Chu, and Richard Sharp. Thank you so much for being part of today's discussions. This is my virtual applause to you, and also our sincere thanks 2. My apologies, that's my alarm for my children. As well for our sincere thanks for FBEC as well for helping us to organize the event. Do complete the evaluation form that you're going to be receiving in a few days. Do stay tuned to check out our website for upcoming learning opportunities. I've told you of one with respect to disaggregated data within the public service on December the 4th. I do want to mention a couple more. On December 11th, we have an event around supporting the recruitment, retention, and development of Indigenous employees. Join us then. And finally, for those of you who may be familiar with the school's podcast, which is called Innovate on Demand, the next episode will actually feature Mr. Aurora, our chief statistician himself, speaking on the data revolution and its implications for the Government of Canada. And so if you're not familiar with it, the Innovate on Demand podcast is free and can be found on both the school websites as well as Apple and Google podcast stores. So with that, thank you again, everyone, for joining us today. Have a great rest of the day. And thank you again to my guest panelists for joining us. À la prochaine.
See you next time.